As the U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff unveils a new ceasefire proposal, hopes for an end to the bloodshed in Gaza rise again. Hamas says it has accepted a framework for a ceasefire and full withdrawal of the Israeli occupation army. Witkoff's modified proposal includes the release of the bodies of 18 deceased detainees alongside 10 living ones in 2 rounds. Additionally, both sides would agree to a 60-day ceasefire. At the end of this period, the proposal permits Israel to resume fighting or extend the ceasefire if meaningful negotiations took place. But inside the Israeli government, deep divisions threaten the deal as far-right Finance Minister Smotrich rejects any partial agreement. What is the fate of the ceasefire proposal? Will Netanyahu's far-right government sabotage the deal? And what guarantees will truly secure peace for Gaza? I'm Salma Al-Fi'i and welcome to In-Depth. The Jerusalem Post quoted sources saying that the U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff has presented Israel and Hamas with a modified version of his detainee release ceasefire deal proposal. The proposal included the release of 18 deceased detainees' bodies alongside 10 living ones in 2 rounds. Also, it proposes a 60-day ceasefire, after which Israel can resume fighting if it wishes or extend the ceasefire if meaningful negotiations took place, according to the Jerusalem Post. The occupation forces would withdraw from recently captured areas, and the distribution of humanitarian aid would return to the United Nations instead of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. This may indicate that the humanitarian situation in Gaza is the driving factor behind the new proposal. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called for a cabinet meeting on Thursday evening to discuss the proposal. Ministers were invited to the cabinet meeting, including Finance Minister Smotrich, who opposed any potential deal, calling it foolish. On the other hand, the opposition leader Yair Lapid urged Netanyahu to accept the deal even if Ben-Gvir and Smotrich try to sabotage it.
U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff announces a new proposal for a Gaza ceasefire and detainee exchange, expressing optimism about a breaking through within days. Meanwhile, Hamas leaders say they agreed to a general framework for a permanent ceasefire, calling for a full withdrawal of the Israeli occupation army from Gaza and the return of detainees. But in Tel Aviv, Israeli political leaders appear divided. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich calls any partial deal madness, warning it would give Hamas time to recover. In contrast, Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar responded by voicing support for any chance to release Israeli detainees, saying the majority wants a deal. Sources close to the talks say the main points are the sequence of detainee releases and guarantees for a permanent ceasefire, while the White House is optimistic that Witkoff's proposal would be able to bridge the gaps and end the war. Inside Gaza, humanitarian suffering continues. The U.S.-Israeli-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation began deliveries this week, but chaotic, insufficient distribution deepened the crisis. Talks are ongoing, but pressure is rising. For Palestinians under siege, time is running out, and the need for a ceasefire and adequate access to aid is more pressing than ever.
For more analysis, we are joined from Cairo by Dr. Mohammed Osman, the International Relations Specialist, and Mr. Mohammed Izzeddin, El Ahram Managing Editor. Welcome, gentlemen, to In Depth. Let me start off by asking Dr. Osman. The envoy, Steve Witkoff, has expressed optimism about a soon-to-be finalized written agreement that could lead to a ceasefire and a detainee deal. How, sir, do you see and assess the credibility of this optimism? Do you believe the United States is finally able to bridge the gap between Hamas and the Israeli occupation, in your opinion?
Thank you for having me, Salma. If I'm not mistaken, this is not the first time Mr. Witkoff has expressed optimism since the beginning of his involvement in the mediation process, since the mid-January 2025. So in my view, his words and his optimism bears very little credence and weight until anything materializes on the ground, because if anything, the United States always makes these pledges and promises and hints that an agreement is imminent, and then we are cheerily disappointed by the results at the end of the day. And this is, of course, due to the unwillingness of the United States, whether the Biden administration before that or the Trump administration now, to exert any serious pressure on the Israeli side. It seems that Mr. Witkoff is now proposing a formula that is not so different from his previous propositions: a temporary 60-day ceasefire, an Israeli withdrawal from the regions captured or the territories captured after the 18th of March, meaning that it will not be a full withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, and the flow of aid into the Gaza Strip through the distribution of aid through the UN and humanitarian organizations, and also a detainee exchange, about 1,000 Palestinian prisoners of war, and for about 10 living Israeli detainees. Yeah. And finally, a promise or a pledge of a framework for a framework for negotiations for a permanent ceasefire. However, if they do not yield any results, Israel reserves the right to snap back into hostilities once again after 60 days. This hardly sounds like a serious proposition to me. However, the Palestinians are being flexible nevertheless, yet the Israelis still reject this proposition.
Well, let's go to Mr. Izzeddin. The Israeli Finance Minister Smotrich called any partial deal with Hamas a delusional folly and vowed to block it. How deep is the internal split within the Israeli government, and how is it influencing Netanyahu's decision-making?
Certainly, it's expected from the far-right officials, which dominates the mindset of Israel, and it's even controlling the government instead of the prime minister, who's only hanging on to his position to evade legal accountability. Here it's about continuing the settlement scheme, whether by obtaining new lands and annexing new lands from Gaza and dividing them military and administration wise, in addition to the continuing aggressions against women and children and civilians, or by continuing the settlements in the West Bank, annexing more lands, which means that there is an agreement between far-right officials, in addition to the generals, the far-right generals as well, who are selected by Netanyahu to continue this scheme. But the Israeli moderate minds are now paying attention to bringing back the live detainees. There has been a lot of casualties, whether at the level of the economy or the state of Israel, as the European Union has started to take a real stance towards Israel, considering the cancelling of some economic agreements or stopping giving weapons to Israel for the first time for a long time. Which means that
can I go back to Dr. Osman, and let me ask you, sir, Hamas has agreed to a general framework for a 60-day ceasefire, which includes a full withdrawal of the occupation army from Gaza and international guarantees. From your perspective, sir, how viable is such a framework in the current geopolitical climate, especially considering Israeli opposition to a full withdrawal?
You see, Salma, this is the problem. We have a sheer amount of ambiguity at our hands and many contradictions, because what Hamas and the Palestinian factions are saying is that there's an American proposition on the table that includes, that stipulates a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and also a permanent a ceasefire eventually. However, on the other hand, what the American sources are saying is that no, it's not a permanent ceasefire, it's a temporary 60-day ceasefire, and it will only be a partial evacuation or withdrawal from Gaza. So you see, there are a lot of contradictions. So Hamas is agreeing to something while the Americans are claiming that Hamas will agree to something else. And the Israelis, in both situations, so far have rejected or have not been willing to accept or interact positively with these propositions. And of course, that is due to the internal pressure inside Israel. Netanyahu faces the prospects of the collapses of his governing coalition if he accepts even a partial truce or a temporary ceasefire, because this has been expressed by Smotrich, the head of the Minister of Finance and the head of the religious Zionism party, and as well as by Ben Gvir, the Minister of National Security, and his party, the Qnews Yehudit, and even other ministers in the cabinet from the far right have expressed their willingness or their intention to resign and collapse the government if Netanyahu accepts. So on the one hand, we have the sheer amount of pressure, and on the other hand, of course, the families of the detainees and the leftist Israeli opposition is pressuring Netanyahu to accept
the deal, to accept
proposition. Exactly. So that's the problem. However, judging by how Netanyahu works, he will always lean towards his own political survival. So as long as he cannot secure the consent of his counterparts within the governing coalition, I do not think he will be willing to accept the ceasefire proposal unless the United States exerts serious pressure.
Well, Mr. Izzeddin, going back to you, the proposal lets Israel resume fighting after the 60 days ceasefire end if it wishes. Could, do you think Netanyahu use this clause to maybe appease his hardliners while agreeing to the deal maybe publicly?
This is expected, unfortunately, because the Israeli officials are never committed to any pledges, and this is what happened when they violated the agreement in March 18th. There must be real written guarantees, and these guarantees should not be only by the mediators, but with international pressuring support to pressure Israel. Even with the humanitarian aid access, it was a stigma and a failure which even harmed the Palestinians further and not protected them from starvation. There is the Israeli insistence to continue occupying the Gaza Strip even following the ceasefire, and the attempts are ongoing either by the far-right officials or the far-right generals who want to continue the war and partition the Gaza Strip into administrative regions with military rule and military governance, with the humanitarian aid distribution mechanism which has failed significantly. And here it's about a political leadership and political witness which is not there in the Israeli case. They will work to fail any attempt for a ceasefire agreement, and in spite of all the concessions provided by the Palestinian resistance, the interpretations always which led to re-proposing the Wetkoff proposal and reforming them will be announced during the next few hours in an attempt to approach the views of the far-right government and the leaders of the Palestinian resistance, the negotiators in Doha and Cairo.
Okay, going back again to Dr. Osman, the occupation army would withdraw from the newly captured areas and aid distribution would revert back to the UN. Could this shift from the controversial Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to the UN maybe be a sign that the US acknowledges the failure of its previous approach, do you think?
I think it is a very tacit acknowledgement that their formula or their mechanism of aid distribution is rather flawed and completely unscientific because it is not based on the guidelines of humanitarian work, which necessitates that the distributor of the aid has to be an impartial party, a party that is not involved in the conflict. However, in the case of the United States, Israel, and even the United States, they are parties to the conflict. And we have seen the very chaotic beginning of the aid distribution with the riots at one of the aid distribution centers and tens of thousands of hungry Palestinians storming the distribution post and looting the storages. So it did not, and of course, people were hurt. The Israeli occupation forces shot and killed and wounded several people. So it wasn't really a harmonious process. While on the other hand, with the UNRWA and other specialized UN agencies and humanitarian NGOs and the Red Cross and the Red Crescent were undertaking the aid distribution, it was much more harmonious and much more practical and efficient. So now the United States is giving this. I don't think they are admitting its failure. They know that moving distribution to the Israeli and American side is a means of pressure against Hamas, or that's how they view it. So now they are hinting to Hamas that they might offer them a concession, meaning that the aid distribution might be moved back or transferred back to the UN and the humanitarian organizations once more in order to facilitate more delivery of humanitarian aid to the populace, which means that which is seen as a concession to the Palestinians in order to force them or pressure them to accept Steve Witkoff's proposal for a temporary ceasefire for 60
Mr.
days.
Azedine,
Yes, go ahead.
let me go back to Mr. Azedine. The far-right ministers like Smotrich and Ben Gvir are invited to the cabinet meeting that will discuss Witkoff's proposal, while on the other hand, Lapid urged Netanyahu to bypass them and accept the deal immediately, and he supports him in that. Is there a real possibility maybe Netanyahu will act against his far-right allies and align with the opposition to pass the deal, do you think?
I don't think there is even 1% of hope in this regard. There are a lot of pressures practiced against Netanyahu from the government, in addition to his fears, on the other hand, of the deterioration of the far-right coalition supporting him, either from the religious Zionist movement or other parties such as the Likud party. It's a very intricate situation here. I think that there will be a public agreement to agree on the release of 5 detainees, for example, and as the Palestinian resistance is totally against releasing all the live detainees, but it will be a good intention. But the Israeli side expressed that there is no desire for the Israeli army to withdraw completely from the Gaza Strip, and we have the experience that this government never commit to their pledges. Of course, there is a tiny positive side, but as with what happened with the violation of the first agreement, they bring back some of the detainees, and then the occupation continues and resumes the war once again. Here we are looking for a hidden disagreement that will, a hidden agreement that will be held with the far right officials, and this will be more evident during the upcoming few hours.
Dr. Osman, the 60-day ceasefire allows Israel to resume fighting if no progress is made. Do you see such a conditional ceasefire maybe risk the resumption of war like Israel did in March? Or does it provide maybe a realistic window for negotiations?
In my opinion, no, it doesn't. It doesn't, and it is a farcical proposition to assume that Israel would ever abide by any agreement that gives it a right, or any provisions that give it a right to resume hostilities. We have seen how they did this, how they conducted themselves in the ceasefire, the first long ceasefire this war has witnessed back in January. It was supposed to be a three-phased ceasefire that would have led to the end of the war, and Israel did not reserve any right under the provisions of this ceasefire agreement back then to resume hostilities, yet they unilaterally cancelled the ceasefire, or abrogated the ceasefire, and resumed hostilities, killing over 4,000 people in the past few weeks, mostly innocent civilians.
Children and women.
Exactly, women and children. So I think such a proposition by the United States is designed to allow Israel to buy time in order to free more hostages, score PR victories for President Trump and his administration, and then they can resume hostilities 8 weeks from now, when they can butcher more Palestinians and enact the depopulation and ethnic cleansing scheme that was never abandoned by the United States. The Trump administration adopted clearly a proposition, or proposed a very vile and illegal proposition that called for the displacement of the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, and they have not walked back their position on that so far. So we should never forget that. And I think this is all a ploy by the United States to enable Israel to do whatever it wants and have a free hand ultimately in the occupied Palestinian territories, while scoring a PR victory for President Trump by freeing more detainees, unfortunately. So I find it farcical, Salma, to be honest.
Mr. Azzedine, the new aid proposal cites the humanitarian crisis as a driving factor. To what extent do you think is the worsening humanitarian disaster in Gaza now dictating diplomatic urgency?
Of course, the world is witnessing the massacres committed by the Israeli occupation power, even with the failed humanitarian aid distribution mechanism crafted by Israel and the United States. And we have seen the grievances and the complaints by the UN and the relief organizations, in addition to the healthcare organizations that are highly experienced in the field of aid distribution, and they are only ones able to process the medical situation and the healthcare situation. The Red Crescent and the medical facilities are completely now out of service inside Gaza. Even the Palestinian Red Crescent ambulances are out of fuel, so they are not able to get to some of the red zones called as called by the Israeli occupation, where the Palestinian occupation is working to evacuate and pushing the population into administrative areas that are not proportionate with the volume of populations. It's a logistical failure. Instead of providing different centers for aid distributions, only 3 or 4 points are provided, only 2 of them in the south. and there are no distribution points in the north. Those who need to obtain aid will leave their lands in the north, and on their way back to the north, they will not be allowed by the Israeli forces. Even the aid distribution plan is a logistical plan to support the enablement of the Israeli forces to take control over Gaza. In addition, they're working to liquidate the two-state solution entirely, divide the Gaza Strip, in addition to the ongoing violations. They're taking lands and annexing more lands in the West Bank. These two schemes, the settlement scheme in the West Bank and the occupation of Gaza, are going side by side.
Well, I mean, that was Mohammed Izzeddin, El Ahram managing editor, and Mohammed Osman, the international relations specialist. Thank you, gentlemen, for your insights and for being with me today at In Depth. And that concludes today's episode of In Depth, and thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more updates on Q News.